For a duelist that grew up watching the original series, when naming off iconic cards from the show, any fan would be remiss to forget about Gold Sarcophagus. Originally used as a final gambit by Yugi Muto to ensure that an Egyptian god card would never return, Gold Sarcophagus has always maintained a special place in the hearts of many, while fluctuating in and out of competitive play. A few years later, Gold Sarcophagus would be made a reality in the card game. While it didn't exactly retain its powers from the TV show, Gold Sarcophagus has a very straightforward effect. Banish one card from your deck face up. During your second standby phase after this card's activation, add that card to your hand. Short, sweet, and to the point, it's hard to get confused when figuring out what Gold Sarcophagus does. Think of any single card in your deck you like to see, and it's yours. But there's a catch. As being able to add any card a player desired at will would be much too strong for traditional gameplay, Gold Sarcophagus holds a distinct restriction that not only gives the card a sense of flavor, but actively challenges a player's decision making and planning. While most cards with strong effects usually come with a cost such as paying life points or restricting what they can do for the turn, Gold Sarcophagus takes the idea of a cost in a very different direction, that the card is essentially a 1-for-1 in card economy, but you have to wait 2 turns to finish the transaction. It's no secret that the speed of a standard Yu-Gi-Oh game is constantly increasing, with formats often ending in 4-turn games instead of 8 or more. This makes the prospect of waiting potentially half a game to get the banished card less than appealing. In a slower game state where decks grinded against each other in a war of attrition and resource management, a stronger case for Gold Sarcophagus could be made. But that being said, against high ceiling decks that come out of the gate swinging, on paper, any card in a player's deck at the cost of 2 turns of patience is not enough. Fortunately, in the 12 years since Gold Sarcophagus' creation, cards and strategies have been introduced into the game that not only bridge the gap, but actively incentivize a player to activate Gold Sarcophagus in ways previously considered taboo. With an effect as generic and versatile as Gold Sarcophagus, it was only a matter of time until players began looking for a shortcut to either achieve the chosen card early, or gain an additional effect with the possibility of adding the card as a bonus should it come up 2 turns later. For strategies that revolved around banishing cards from both players' decks, Necroface was an immediate standout, being able to banish 5 cards from both players' decks at will, with a chance for it to return 2 standby phases later with a minimum of 2200 attack. Banished strategies were and continue to be niche, however, and for an effect as powerful such as that of Gold Sarcophagus, it took a much more direct and advantageous incentive to justify playing the card. Enter the Dragon Rulers, a quartet of level 7 behemoths that single-handedly flipped the competitive landscape on its head, and to this day remain one of the most powerful archetypes in the game's history. The Dragon Rulers were so absurd in their design, and that they all packed 3 separate effects on top of boasting large stats that, while restricting players to only choosing 1 per turn, were all immensely powerful and almost always led to dangerously fast card advantage. While being level 7 in an era before pendulum summoning would have otherwise been a one-way ticket to Uncanny Valley, each Dragon Ruler was able to be summoned from the hand or the graveyard by banishing 2 dragon monsters and or monsters of its attribute from the hand or graveyard. And as fate would have it, these Dragon Lures would also include effects if they were banished. Within the context of its deck, it meant that the Dragon Lures were a self-made engine that were fueled by each monster of the archetype, but having a strong effect upon being banished immediately meant that a card such as Gold Sarcophagus could finally shine. In the blink of an eye, players found the immediate value they were searching for out of Gold Sarcophagus, and it didn't take long until it became an immediate staple in every standard Dragon Ruler deck. The card would prove to be so powerful and incredibly common that it would eventually see a limited status on the 2013 TCG Forbidden Unlimited list. While a handful of Dragon Ruler decks would continue to play Gold Sarcophagus despite the limitation, being limited to 1 copy per deck meant that the card was immediately less consistent. As Dragon Rulers brought the card into the spotlight, when it was finally time to take its bow, Gold Sarcophagus too faded into obscurity until it would be used again. With being limited to 1 copy per deck, alongside declining numbers of decks able to utilize the card, Gold Sarcophagus fell on the wayside and returned back to obscurity. Though it saw occasional play in decks such as Ritual Beasts that could utilize having its monsters banished, the format marched on without Gold Sarcophagus and time seemed to forget it, until it was eventually freed 3 years later on the August 2016 Forbidden Unlimited list. Despite having 2 additional copies in the deck, Gold Sarcophagus would still struggle to find a home in the competitive scene. It wasn't until Lightsworn was able to utilize the card by way of Shiranui's Spirit Master and Giant Rex, 2 level 4 monsters that received effects when banished. As Giant Rex could special summon itself if it were banished, alongside Shiranui's Spirit Master destroying a face-up card if it's banished, Gold Sarcophagus was able to maintain the viability and versatility that it once had with Dragon Rulers, albeit to a much smaller extent. Acting as either an extender or a form of removal, Gold Sarcophagus was slowly but surely appearing in YCO's top cut decks once more. The Lightsworn was only scratching the surface once Soul Fusion arrived, bringing with it a new troop of Thunder Dragon support that milked the card for all it's worth. The original Thunder Dragon was notorious for thinning the deck, much like Doom Table of Contents, and acted as a free +1 with the occasional Chaos deck utilizing it as a light to place in the graveyard. That being said, as cards from this early stage of the game go, Thunder Dragon was hardly iconic. That's why so many people were surprised when it became its own archetype in 2018. Adhering to the original Thunder Dragon's design, all of these new Thunder Dragon monsters could activate an effect by discarding them from your hand, but also had an effect if they were sent from the field to the graveyard, or if they were banished. Naturally, with a deck full of effects that activated when they were banished, it seemed only natural that the Gold Sarcophagus would be at the ready to make its triumphant return. And, for lack of a better term, it did. Sporting an effect like Emergency Teleport or Reinforcement of the Army, or even Magical Mallet, Gold Sarcophagus enabled the Thunder Dragon deck to do so many different effects within one single card. It's essentially a starter card to end starter cards in the deck, and it's viable at practically any single point of the game. Since their release in July of 2018, the new Thunder Dragon support has been making waves in the OCG, consistently finding itself at the top tables and decklist reports. Gold Sarcophagus has since been limited in the OCG's Forbidden and Limited list as of October because the card was so powerful. It remains to be seen if the deck will have the same impact over in the TCG. But regardless, we've come full circle. As Dragon Rulers were able to rise the card to prominence, only to have it limited as collateral damage for their actions, history seems to be repeating itself in the OCG with Thunder Dragons. But up until this point, we've looked at the card's competitive resume. What about from a neutral point of view in any deck? Earlier on, we established that unless it could grant an effect immediately upon banishing a card, Gold Sarcophagus isn't fast enough to compete with high ceiling decks. With that being said, when playing with or against decks that are more methodical in design, that try to deplete their opponent's resources rather than end them in one turn, Gold Sarcophagus can shine as a tech choice to edge out a match, but not before asking its users some very important questions. First and foremost, assuming a player draws their 5-card hand from a 40-card deck and activates Gold Sarcophagus, if not to trigger a specific effect, what card are they choosing out of their now 35-card deck? Do keep in mind that Gold Sarcophagus can retrieve any single card in the deck, meaning the extent of its searchability is only as imaginative as its user. However, a lot can happen in 2 turns after all, and though for the sake of this scenario, the game won't inherently be over in 2 turns, by turn 5, it's fair to assume that both players' engines have started and they're now fighting a war of attrition. Consequently, by banishing a starter card that adds monsters from its archetype such as Elemental Hero Stratos or Supreme King Dragon Darkworm, though this investment will ultimately culminate in a +1, by this point in the game, committing a normal summon for a search might not be good enough. It's also important to consider that the player who activated Gold Sarcophagus was immediately down a card advantage from their opponent from the 2 turns, as Gold Sarcophagus has not replaced itself yet. While adding a starter card is certainly powerful, can you confidently say you'll be able to keep up with your opponent, given you've essentially given yourself a temporary -1? From a mathematical standpoint, while the player will eventually receive the card they wanted should the game still be continuing, in the meantime, their probability of drawing another copy of that card decreases. It should be fairly obvious that by banishing a card with Gold Sarcophagus, that player wants it as soon as possible, as there's no incentive to waiting 2 standby phases. Meaning that provided the card banished isn't the only copy in its deck, seeing that card early should not just be acceptable, but more than likely desirable. Should that player not touch their deck at all and continue the game with 34 cards in their deck, the likelihood of them drawing another copy of the banished card, assuming 3 were originally in the deck, falls down to a 5.88% chance, compared to the otherwise 8.82% chance. While that 2% difference might not seem like a huge deal at first glance, once you consider that every other card in your deck now has a 2% higher chance of being drawn over the card you want, it's much more significant. By all accounts, the player who activated Gold Sarcophagus is actively lowering their odds of seeing the card they want, even though they'll eventually get it. Furthermore, because the chosen card is banished face up, the opponent can know ahead of time what will be added to the player's hand in the second standby phase, and can then begin to play around it by preparing for it. While in a vacuum, a card such as Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is very powerful, once a player knows that it's there, they can begin to play around it and navigate around triggering the card, effectively making it useless. That's also under the assumption that in 2 turns, Ash Blossom will still be the correct card to use, as it could very well be too late by that point in the game. As a result, when a player banishes a card with Gold Sarcophagus, assuming the card doesn't immediately do anything, they must ask themselves if they can not only survive with a -1 in card advantage for 2 turns, but where the game will be and what the card will ultimately accomplish. As Gold Sarcophagus is essentially a time capsule for any card in the game, it very much revolves around considering the future, and there aren't many cards like it that ask the player activating it to consider what the rest of the game might look like, or confirm that the card they banished was the correct choice all along. Given these drawbacks, it should be fairly obvious why Gold Sarcophagus isn't a staple in every slower deck in the game, as the consequences behind the decision usually outweigh the positives, and usually in the context of these decks, the pool of cards able to be added aren't inherently strong enough. And realistically, if you were to ask me if Gold Sarcophagus is a bad card, unless it was played to immediately trigger a specific effect, I'd have to say it is. Yet despite the card being decidedly not viable aside from a handful of decks, it's a card that's always fascinated me, and truly is unique. I acknowledge that nobody's going to banish something like a Soul Charge with Gold Sarcophagus, but I just find that it's so neat that it's completely possible, and as mentioned earlier, it's only limited by a player's creativity. And in a deck like Thunder Dragon where it actually is worth running, the prospect of adding some game-ending card is a really exciting thought. I think it adds a really exciting component to watching the game as well as playing it. Even if it's not correct to play 9 times out of 10, I'll firmly argue that there aren't many, if any, cards in the game that manage to be as versatile as Gold Sarcophagus is. Gold Sarcophagus can offer you any card you want that costs some patience. The question is, will you sign the contract?